In this video, we will discuss Christian scripture. For most Christians, the only sacred scripture is the Bible. The Bible, again for most Christians, is composed of the Old Testament and the New Testament. We'll look at each of these in turn, but in some Christian traditions, there is also the Apocrypha, which is between the Old and New Testaments, which is also considered sacred and authoritative scripture. We'll talk about this at the end of the video as well. The Old Testament is very similar to the Hebrew Bible that we see in Judaism. Remember that Christianity has its roots in Judaism. So this ancient text, the Hebrew Bible, becomes the Old Testament. In Christianity, the Hebrew Bible is understood as the first part of the Christian story. Jesus, according to many Christians, is the fulfillment of prophecies and ideas that we see in the Old Testament. Now, the Hebrew Bible, as we've talked about in previous videos for the Jewish scripture, is composed of three parts: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. In Christianity, the Old Testament has four different sections. So rather than the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, we see the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. And the Pentateuch corresponds with the Torah. These are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Afterwards, in the Old Testament, we see history. And this section is composed of many of the prophets that we see in the Hebrew Bible. The history includes books like Samuel, Kings, Ruth, and so on, books that in some way establish the history of ancient Judaism. The next section is wisdom and poetry. These are books like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and so on. These are some of the texts that we see in the Ketuvim in the Hebrew Bible, but are in this wisdom and poetry section of the Old Testament. And finally, in the Old Testament, we see the prophets. These prophets are the latter prophets, so Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets that we see in the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament is seen as the most important text in Christianity. The New Testament provides the second part of a Christian's history, at least in the understanding of the tradition, while the Old Testament sets forth the very beginnings of Judaism from which Christianity has developed and which Jesus was a part of. The New Testament establishes Jesus' life, teachings, and the history of the beginnings of the Christian tradition. In the New Testament, we see 4 different types of texts. And the first of these are the Gospels. Gospel literally means good news. And the texts we see here recount the life and teachings of Jesus, the founder of this tradition. There are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of which appear to be written by the person whose name was put on the text centuries after they were written. The Gospels are the beginnings of the tradition. They describe who the founder of the tradition is, what he did, and how he died, and beginning into how his followers carried on after his death. The book of Acts, also called Acts of the Apostles, functions as the history of the tradition, and explains the history as well as the spread of Christianity, at least in the very beginnings of this movement after the death of Jesus. In Acts, we see figures like Paul, who end up being missionaries and spreading this new gospel to other people. The epistles, or letters, function as the beliefs and ethics of the tradition. We see letters here from Paul. Some are definitely written by Paul, some probably are not, some almost definitely are not. We also have some that are attributed to other New Testament figures, like Peter and James. The epistles tell us some of the beliefs and ethics of the tradition by these early Christian figures writing to various churches on things that they need to do, or fix, or not do in their churches or in their lives. At the end of the New Testament, we see the book of Revelation. This text is actually disputed pretty early on in the church for whether it should be part of the canon or not. And this functions as apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literally means hidden things, and the text has to do with some kind of coded message, more than likely about the political situation that the Christians were facing in Rome at the time. In some Bibles, you will find apocryphal literature as well. This is typically in the Roman Catholic Church as well as in some Eastern Orthodox traditions, but you typically won't find this in many Protestant traditions. Apocrypha literally means hidden books, and these texts are books that, by many accounts, are not considered sacred or authoritative, but in some traditions they are. The Apocrypha includes books like 1st Esdras, additions to Esther, additions to the Book of Daniel, Tobit, Judith, and so on. These texts are called the Old Testament Apocrypha. These texts were written significantly after the writing of the Old Testament, but were considered by some Christians to be authoritative, and so are included in the Bible. These texts were actually part of the King James Version for centuries before they were eventually taken out. Later in this course, we'll talk about New Testament Apocrypha a bit, and New Testament Apocrypha is typically not considered to be part of Christian scripture. These are texts that are by and large rejected by most Christians, regardless of denomination, as non-canonical and non-authoritative. These are texts like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Regular Gospel of Thomas, and so on, that help us to understand some more about early Christianity, but typically by both Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestants are typically rejected as non-authoritative or sacred texts. Now that we have reached the end of this video, you should be able to identify the two main sections of Christian scripture, explain what the Old Testament and New Testament are and how they function as scripture, and describe what apocryphal literature it is and how it often functions as scripture in the Christian tradition.